You will not believe what happens to the girl at the end. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can continue writing stories like this one. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
The blizzard's fury. The cabin marred the unbroken expanse of the prairie like a scab. A boxy structure of roughly hewn logs, its mud daubing flaking at the slightest provocation, it reeked of chilled earth and a wild musk she couldn't place. Ruth lowered herself onto the bunk's edge, the twins pressed against her, their small forms surprisingly dense. The wagon train, once a hopeful caravan, had withered to a scattering of families, desperation carved into every face. They had deposited her at this desolate refuge, promising a spring return, promises murmured with downcast gazes and the rushed farewells of men eager to shed the weight of a widow and her infants. She harbored no resentment. Not truly. She understood she was a hindrance, a drag anchor against their escape. Yet, a keen ache throbbed in her core, a new stratum of sorrow settling atop the old. She was marooned, abandoned in a way that resonated in her bones. As dusk deepened to a bruised violet, the wind escalated, clawing at the inadequately fitted door with a dolorous keen that mirrored the hollowness within. Snow commenced its descent, plump, listless flakes that swiftly coalesced into a swirling shroud. Ruth stoked the fire, feeding it precious slivers from the woodpile stacked precariously outside, uncertain of how long her supplies would hold. Mary and Martha stirred, their tiny mouths searching for solace. Ruth unfastened her bodice, offering them her breast. Their suckling was a meager, fierce comfort, a palpable connection in an alien landscape. Gazing at her daughters, a spark of defiance ignited deep within. She would endure. For them. By nightfall, the blizzard had evolved into a ravening beast. The wind shrieked, hammering against the cabin, striving to wrench it from its precarious foundation. Snow accumulated against the door, a white barrier rising higher with each gust. Ruth crammed rags into the crevices around the windows and door, yet the wind persisted, a frigid, probing tendril that slithered across the floor. Sleep proved elusive. The gale's savagery kept her wired, each blast a perceived threat. She huddled close to the hearth, the twins warm against her, their gentle breathing a soothing counterpoint to the storm's fury. She hummed softly, antiquated hymns learned from her mother, her voice a fragile bulwark against the encroaching darkness. Dawn broke, not with a gentle luminance, but with an oppressive white glare. The blizzard remained relentless, possibly even intensifying. Ruth squinted through the small window but discerned only swirling snow, a dizzying vortex that obliterated the world. The cabin was a lone sentinel in a white void. She carefully portioned her dwindling provisions, a scant handful of flour, some desiccated beans, a few strips of cured pork. Enough for a handful of days, perhaps. Beyond that, she refused to dwell on it. Another day dissolved into night, the storm an unyielding force. Ruth's woodpile shrunk visibly. She resorted to dismantling furniture, splintering the flimsy chairs and the rough-hewn table to feed the insatiable flames. The cabin grew colder, the wind discovering new vulnerabilities in its defenses. On the third day, the wagon train reappeared. Ruth detected them before they materialized, the muted rumble of wheels and the faint cries carried on the biting wind. Hope surged through her, a vibrant, unexpected tide. She scrambled to the door, shoving against the snowdrift that had sealed it shut. Finally, she wrestled it open, revealing a scene of stark desperation. The wagons were nearly buried in snow, the horses straining with visible effort. The men were swathed in furs, their faces drawn, their eyes haunted and defeated. The wagon master, a skeletal figure with a beard caked in ice, approached with trepidation, his voice rasped raw by the cold and regret. "Mrs. Miller," he addressed her, his words barely audible above the gale's shriek. "We can't." Ruth fixed him with a stare, the warmth of hope congealing into a glacial knot in her stomach. "Can't what?" "We can't take you," he stated, his gaze falling to the snow at his feet. "The storm, it's too much. We'll never make it if we have to accommodate you. The horses are failing, the supplies are depleted. We have to prioritize the others." A wave of sickness gripped Ruth. She clutched the doorframe for support, her knuckles bone white. "You're abandoning me?" she breathed, the words snatched away by the wind. "We have to," he replied, his voice a mere whisper. "We'll dispatch a rescue party when the weather clears. We promise. But now we have to save ourselves." He avoided eye contact, unable to bear her pain. Another man stepped forward, shame etched upon his face. He pressed a small leather pouch into Ruth's hand. "It's all we can afford to spare," he choked out. "Godspeed, Mrs. Miller." Then they vanished. The wagons lurched forward, dissolving into the swirling white chaos, leaving Ruth standing alone in the doorway, the wind lashing at her, the pouch of coins a leaden weight in her palm. She tracked their progress until they were consumed by the tempest, until the only sound remaining was the wind's relentless lament. Then she carefully, deliberately closed the door, isolating herself from the world, from the faintest glimmer of hope. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. She turned back to the cabin, to the flickering glow of the fire, to the two small faces that gazed up at her with unwavering faith. And at that instant, a new resolve hardened within her soul. They had left her for dead, expecting her demise. But they would be proven wrong. She would not allow her daughters to perish. She would engage in a desperate struggle. She would conquer. She would defy the storm, the odds, the despair that threatened to drown her. She would resort to anything to safeguard her children. She piled more wood onto the fire, swathed the twins tightly in their blankets, and steeled herself for the long, bleak night. The blizzard continued its assault, but within the confines of the humble cabin, a different kind of tempest was gathering, the storm of a mother's love, fierce and immovable, a power as formidable as the prairie wind itself. Hope and faith. The gale pummeled the small dwelling, a ravenous beast seeking entry. Ruth burrowed deeper under the worn quilt, her arms a protective cage around the infants. Hope, she breathed, tucking a stray wisp of hair behind the ear of the child to her left. The baby met her gaze with unblinking, earnest eyes, seemingly oblivious to the tempest's wrath. And you, Faith, she whispered to the other twin, whose brow was perpetually furrowed in a tiny scowl. You'll both require those qualities, my loves. Hope to sustain us, and faith that dawn will break again. The names felt like a flimsy barricade against the tide of despair. Hope and faith. She intoned them silently, a bulwark against the encroaching dread threatening to overwhelm her. The cabin's temperature plummeted. The fire she had coaxed into being was now a pathetic ember, the scant wood pile diminishing with alarming swiftness. Ruth worried her lip, her eyes scanning the perimeter. There was nothing more. The wagon train had gutted this place, leaving behind only the barest essentials dwindling by the minute. Gingerly, she unwrapped Faith, the infant's small form shivering despite the swaddling. Ruth knew they needed nourishment, but her own supply was slow in coming, a bitter reminder of her declining condition. A small quantity of dried milk remained, enough perhaps for 2 or 3 feedings, but she hesitated, loath to deplete it. Once gone, it was irretrievable. Hush now, little one, she soothed, rocking Faith gently. Mama will find a way. But the words sounded hollow even to her, and the infant's cries intensified, echoing the storm's relentless caterwaul. With a sigh, Ruth returned Faith to her sister's side and rose, her joints protesting. She had to revive the fire. Rummaging through the meager kindling, her fingers brushed against rough bark. Little remained, mostly damp fragments resistant to flame. She recalled her father's lessons on fire building from childhood. Patience, he had advised, and a touch of luck. But patience was a forgotten luxury, and fortune felt utterly absent. Frustration pricked at her. She crumpled a scrap of paper unearthed from her pocket and fed it to the flickering flames. It flared briefly, then succumbed, leaving a wisp of acrid smoke. Think, Ruth, think. She closed her eyes, grasping for any useful memory. The wagon master had alluded to a hidden wood stash somewhere near the cabin, left by a prior settler. However, he'd cautioned that it was likely long plundered by travelers or rotted from exposure. Still, a gamble was her only recourse. She couldn't simply remain and await their demise. Enveloping herself in the stoutest blanket available, Ruth cautiously eased open the cabin door. The wind assaulted her, stealing breath and peppering her face with icy needles. The world was a blizzard of white, the cabin barely discernible a short distance away. She faltered, fear tightening her chest. Could she truly abandon the babies, even for mere moments? But the specter of them freezing propelled her forward. She had to attempt it. I'll return swiftly, she pledged to the twins, her voice lost in the wind's roar. Just briefly. She ventured into the squall, her vision sweeping the snow-laden terrain. The wagon master had specified that the woodpile was concealed near the cabin's rear, bordering the tree line. But the tree line was obscured, let alone any semblance of a woodpile. She floundered through the drifts, her extremities numb. She stumbled over a partially submerged log, collapsing onto the earth. Momentarily, she lingered there, the wind lashing her, the cold permeating her very core. She yearned to surrender, to shut her eyes and be claimed by the storm. But then she envisioned hope and faith, their delicate features, their fragile existences resting on her. And a surge of tenacity surged through her, hoisting her upright. She persevered, her sight impaired by the snow and her physique throbbing with exhaustion. At last, through the swirling tempest, she perceived it, a small hummock of snow-covered timber barely distinguishable against the backdrop. With shaky fingers, she commenced excavation, flinging the snow aside in frenzied bursts. The wood was sodden and unwieldy, but enough remained to endure the night, perhaps longer. Jubilation flooded her, thawing her from within. She amassed what she could carry and staggered back toward the cabin, her gait labored but resolute. Re-entering, she arranged the wood by the hearth and promptly kindled a fresh fire. This time, the flames ignited readily, fueled by her desperation and the relatively drier wood. Soon, a comforting radiance permeated the cabin, banishing the shadows and the chill. She unwrapped the twins, scrutinizing them for signs of exposure. Their complexions were pale, but still warm to the touch. A wave of relief washed over her, so profound it nearly buckled her knees. She fed Faith the last of the dried milk, watching as the baby's frantic suckling gradually eased, yielding to a contented sigh. Then she offered Hope her breast, feeling a surge of maternal protection as the infant latched on, her tiny body pressed against Ruth's. As the fire crackled warmly and the babies slumbered peacefully in her arms, Ruth commenced to sing. It was an age-old lullaby her mother favored, a simple tune extolling love and hope and the promise of a brighter future. Her tone was raspy and wavering, but it imbued the cabin with a sense of tranquility, a delicate harmony against the external tempest. She gazed down at the twins, their countenances bathed in the firelight. Hope and faith. They comprised everything she possessed, but they were adequate. As long as they remained, she would persevere. She would continue to hope. She would maintain her conviction. A cowboy's search. The wind screamed, an unearthly shriek that clawed at Eli's thick coat. Ice crystals, hurled by the tempest, lashed his face, turning the already desolate landscape into a disorienting white blur. He narrowed his eyes, tugging his Stetson lower, the brim offering scant protection from the icy assault. Buck, his loyal Appaloosa, bowed his head against the gale, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Each stride taxed the animal's muscles as he battled the mounting drifts. "Steady, boy," Eli's voice was a fragile thread against the storm's roar. He stroked Buck's neck, feeling the tremor of strain. "We'll find them. We always have." Yet a cold premonition gripped him. This wasn't merely a blizzard, it was a frozen hell, and the herd, scattered across the exposed range, wouldn't survive without shelter. He imagined them bunched together, shaggy coats offering meager defense against the brutal cold, their frightened bellows lost in the wind's howl. He pressed Buck onward, searching the obscured horizon for any sign of the cattle. Only the stark silhouettes of hardy cottonwoods punctuated the white expanse, their snow-burdened limbs groaning in protest. Since dawn, he'd been driving himself relentlessly, fueled by coffee and grim resolve, but the storm showed no mercy. A sudden gust slammed into him, momentarily stealing his vision in a swirl of white. Buck gave a startled whinny, faltering slightly. Eli tightened his grip on the reins, his pulse quickening. He knew this land intimately, yet in this maelstrom everything appeared alien, warped. His thoughts drifted to Sarah, his wife. Her joyous laughter, the sunlight dancing in her auburn hair, the comforting weight of her hand in his. 3 years since influenza stole her away, but the hollow ache of her absence remained, a constant shadow in his solitary existence. He recalled their last winter together, nestled by the hearth, sharing stories and aspirations. She could always conjure warmth even on the bleakest days. Now, a perpetual twilight seemed to reside within him. He glimpsed her face in the swirling flakes, a fleeting, spectral image that vanished instantly. A painful lump rose in his throat, he forced it down. He couldn't indulge in remembrance now. He had a duty, a responsibility to the creatures reliant on him. Buck snorted, shaking his head, ears flicking. Eli followed the horse's alerted gaze and discerned a darkened form emerging from the white void. He squinted, straining to see clearly. A fence line, partially submerged beneath the snow yet standing defiantly. A promising sign. Fences marked boundaries, and boundaries suggested the herd might be closer to refuge. He urged Buck forward, encouraging him toward the fence. The horse responded with renewed effort, battling through the deepening drifts. As they neared, Eli made out more, a small thicket of pines huddled together, their branches draped in snow, and a noticeable lessening of the wind's fury. A paltry sanctuary, but preferable to the open range. He hoped the cattle possessed the instinct to seek shelter there. Approaching the trees, Buck abruptly halted, his body rigid. He pawed the ground, snorting uneasily. Eli felt a prickle of apprehension. Buck was usually unflappable, but clearly something disturbed him. "What is it, boy?" Eli inquired, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle hanging across his back. Buck whinnied again, eyes wide, nudging his head toward the pines. Eli followed his gaze, his heart hammering. Something felt amiss. The quiet beneath the pines was deafening, absolute, broken only by the wind's mournful cry. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. He tied Buck to a solid branch, commanding stay. The horse stood shivering. He drew his rifle, senses heightened, and cautiously approached the tree's edge. He peered into the shadows, his eyes sweeping across every hidden space. He saw no cattle, no sign of movement. Only the ceaseless snow, the oppressive quiet, and a rising tide of dread. Then he spotted it. A slight, almost invisible dent in the snow, partially hidden by a fallen branch. It looked out of place. A small rise in a world of flat white. Eli held his breath, carefully moved closer, and knelt, brushing away the snow with his gloved hand. Beneath the snow, he uncovered a roughly constructed lean-to made of branches and canvas. Nearly consumed by snow. A jolt of adrenaline surged through him. Someone was here. But who? And why? He reached for the canvas flap, his hand trembling minutely. He hesitated a moment, a sense of foreboding settling over him. What he was about to discover could alter everything. He inhaled deeply and tugged the flap aside. Beneath the snow, the wind held a mournful dirge, each gust a biting lash against Eli's exposed skin. He pulled his scarf higher, the ruffle offering scant comfort against the relentless cold. Buck, usually a steady and willing partner, had grown increasingly restless. The Appaloosa snorted, his breath forming twin plumes of vapor that vanished instantly into the swirling white. They pressed on, following the faint rise of what Eli hoped was the crest of a small hill. From there, he might be able to get his bearings, at least enough to determine which direction the fence line lay. The missing cattle were hardy stock, but even they wouldn't last long exposed to the storm. Suddenly, Buck stopped dead in his tracks. His muscles tensed, and he pawed at the snow with a foreleg, kicking up a flurry of icy crystals. "Easy, boy," Eli said, his voice barely audible above the wind's scream. He stroked Buck's neck, trying to soothe him, but the horse remained rigid, his ears twitching nervously. He stamped again, harder this time, a low whinny rumbling in his chest. Something was amiss. Buck wasn't usually skittish. He'd weathered far worse storms than this without complaint. Eli scanned the landscape, but the blizzard obscured everything beyond a few feet. "What is it, old friend?" he muttered, more to himself than to the horse. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The cold seeped through the thick leather, almost instantly biting at his toes. He tethered Buck to a stunted, snow-laden bush, trusting the horse's instincts. "Stay put," he commanded, though he doubted Buck would wander far in this weather. Eli moved cautiously forward, his eyes straining to penetrate the swirling white. He circled the area where Buck had stopped, his gloved hands sweeping the snow-covered ground. The wind threatened to rip the gloves from his hands, but he held on tight, his fingers already numb. He felt it first, a subtle change in the texture of the snow beneath his boots. It was less yielding, firmer, as if packed down. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the snow with his hands. The wind whipped the snow into his face, stinging his eyes, but he persisted, digging deeper. Gradually, an outline began to emerge, a straight line, then another, forming a corner. He followed the lines, his heart pounding in his chest. It couldn't be. He continued to clear the snow, his movements becoming more frantic, driven by a growing sense of disbelief. More lines appeared, defining a shape, a rectangle. He traced the perimeter, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. It was a building. Or rather, the remains of one. A cabin. Almost completely buried beneath the snowdrifts, it was barely discernible from the surrounding landscape. Only the faint, straight lines gave it away. He could see the suggestion of a roofline, sagging under the weight of the snow, and what looked like the top of a door, nearly sealed shut by the icy accumulation. Eli stood up slowly, his body aching from the cold and exertion. He stared at the snow-covered structure, his mind racing. Who would build a cabin in such a desolate place? And why was it abandoned? Or was it? A shiver ran down his spine, not entirely from the cold. The discovery of the lean-to yesterday had been unsettling. A hint of something unseen, something hidden in this unforgiving land. This cabin, it amplified that feeling tenfold. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the frozen snow. The wind howled around him, a mournful cry that seemed to emanate from the cabin itself. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the snow-covered wall. The wood beneath felt cold and solid, yet strangely fragile. He had to know if anyone was inside. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, momentarily overriding the bone-deep weariness. He began to clear the snow from around the door, his movements now driven by a sense of urgency. The snow was packed hard, frozen solid in places. It took him several minutes to clear a small opening, just enough to reveal the outline of a wooden door, warped and weathered by years of exposure. He pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. It was either frozen shut or blocked from the inside. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice barely carrying above the wind. "Is anyone there?" He waited, listening intently, but heard nothing but the relentless roar of the blizzard. He tried again, louder this time, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" Still nothing. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear any sound, any sign of life. The wind whistled through the cracks in the wood, creating an eerie, unsettling melody. He thought he heard something else, a faint scratching sound, but he couldn't be sure. He stepped back, his mind filled with conflicting thoughts. He couldn't just leave, not knowing if someone was trapped inside. But he also couldn't risk his own life trying to break into a cabin that might be empty. The storm was worsening, and he needed to find shelter for himself and for Buck. He glanced at the sky, the swirling snow making it impossible to judge the time. Darkness would be upon them soon, and the temperature would plummet even further. He had to make a decision. He ran his hand over the door one last time, a silent plea for forgiveness if he was making the wrong choice. Then, with a heavy heart, he turned and walked back towards Buck. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice hoarse with cold and fatigue. "Let's find some shelter." He mounted Buck, and they turned away from the buried cabin, leaving it to the mercy of the storm. But as they rode away, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something important behind, something that would haunt him long after the blizzard had passed. He knew with a chilling certainty that he would be back. He just hoped it wouldn't be too late. A glimmer of life. The wind shrieked like a tormented spirit, battering Eli as he fought the cabin door, a solid sheet of ice gluing it fast. He cursed, the words lost to the tempest's roar. Buck whined behind him, sensing his unease. Bracing a boot against the weathered wood, Eli strained, his muscles screaming. The hinges emitted a tortured groan, metal protesting the icy grip. A sudden crack, like a gunshot, announced the door's surrender, collapsing inward with a soft thump. Stepping inside offered scant relief from the gale, though the biting wind lessened, replaced by stagnant, frigid air thick with the scent of decay. Shadows reigned within, a feeble, dusty light barely piercing the grimy window panes. Eli's vision struggled to compensate. His fingers fumbled for matches, the sulfurs scratched a startling sound in the heavy silence. A fragile flame bloomed, revealing a meagerly furnished room. A chill deeper than the air's temperature settled over him. It was the pervasive sense of desolation, heavier than the dust mote swirling in the dimness. A wobbly table stood near the window, cluttered with tattered fabric remnants. A rusted stove cowered in the corner, inert. Then he noticed them. In the farthest recess, huddled amongst worn blankets, sat a woman. Her face was ashen and drawn, her eyes immense and hollow in the gloom. She clutched 2 bundles to her, trembling. 2 miniature faces peeked from beneath the covers. "Hello?" Eli's voice, raspy from disuse, echoed strangely. "Are you all right?" She offered no reply, only stared back, her gaze wary, almost animalistic. He advanced cautiously, boots crunching on the earthen floor. The sound made her flinch, tightening her hold on the bundles. "Easy," Eli soothed, his tone softer now. "I won't hurt you." He raised his hands, palms displayed in a gesture of peace. "I saw the cabin, just checking if you needed anything." Her lips moved soundlessly, forming unheard words. He leaned closer. "Water," she croaked, her voice a thread. "Please, water." Eli exhaled in relief. They were alive. He moved towards the table, spotting a chipped enamel pitcher, empty. He grabbed a pail near the door and rushed back into the storm, the wind lashing his face. Scooping up snow, he filled the bucket. Returning inside, he placed it by the stove, hoping for a quick melt. Back with the woman, he found her motionless, eyes still locked on him. Kneeling, he tried to discern the baby's features. Their skin was pale, their diminutive chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. "How long have you been here?" he inquired gently. "Days," she whispered, a hint of strength returning. "We were separated from the wagon train. They abandoned us." Eli's jaw hardened. To leave a woman and newborns to perish in this desolate place, it defied belief. He suppressed his anger, focusing on their urgent needs. "Their names?" he asked, nodding toward the infants. "Hope," she answered, indicating the child on her left. "And Faith." Eli observed the tiny countenances. Hope and Faith. A delicate spark in the overwhelming darkness. He noticed the almost invisible twitch of their tiny fingers, the feather-light softness of their wispy hair. A long dormant feeling stirred within him. A fierce protectiveness, a fundamental urge to shelter them from the brutality of the world. The snow was beginning to liquefy. He soaked a rag and gently touched it to the woman's chapped lips. She closed her eyes, a hint of gratitude flickering across her expression. Offering the rag to Hope and Faith, he was careful not to disturb their rest. He knew he couldn't abandon them. Not for another moment. The cabin offered scant shelter, and the mother was clearly too frail to provide proper care. He needed to get them to his ranch, to warmth and security. But the ranch lay miles distant, and the blizzard showed no sign of relenting. The journey would be perilous, even for a seasoned rider. And now he carried their lives in his hands. He gazed at Ruth, Hope, and Faith huddled together, their fragile existences hanging precariously. He knew what he must do. He had to get them out. Now. The image of his cozy hearth, the scent of wood smoke and pine needles surged through him, renewing his determination. He stood, resolve solidifying. He would bring them through this. He was compelled to. "We're leaving," he declared, his voice resolute. "I'm taking you to my ranch. It's humble but warm and safe. Can you walk?" Ruth looked up, her eyes reflecting a blend of dread and anticipation. She nodded weakly. "I'll try," she breathed. Eli knew it would be agonizing, but they had no viable alternative. He would carry them if necessary. He refused to let them succumb to the elements. He had found them lost in the heart of the storm, and he would guide them back into the light. Journey to the ranch. Eli moved with the ingrained efficiency of a man sculpted by the hard hand of ranch life. He gathered every available blanket from the meager cabin, even salvaging the tattered wool Ruth used to block the window. The fabric, thick with the scent of dust and hearth fires, would at least blunt the wind's icy edge. "Time to go," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos. He avoided Ruth's gaze, sensing the fragility that clung to her like the thin air. "My place is a handful of miles south. It's the only shot you and those babies have." Ruth's nod was small, her eyes reflecting a blend of terror and desperate faith. Her grip tightened around the twins, knuckles bone white. Hope slept on, her face serene, but Faith whimpered, the sound magnified within the close confines of the cabin. With practiced gentleness, Eli cocooned each infant in a blanket, then helped Ruth rise, his arm a steadying brace against her wavering strength. Color had drained from her face, leaving her gaunt and wan. He draped another blanket around her, cinching it tight. "Think you can manage?" he asked, finally meeting her eyes. I don't know," she rasped, her voice a broken echo. "I'll try." He didn't push, instead gently scooping up the sleeping Hope, cradling her securely. "Let me take Faith too." He waited, and when she relinquished the child, adjusted his hold, balancing the combined weight. Adrenaline, a potent cocktail of fear and resolve, surged through him, muting the ache in his arms. Ready as we'll ever be? It was less a question than a pronouncement. Ruth inhaled deeply and nodded again. The cabin door groaned open, unleashing the blizzard's full fury. Snow stung their exposed skin, obliterating the world in a vortex of white. Buck, restless with apprehension, whined and pressed against Eli's leg. He reached down, a quick pat offering wordless comfort. "Stay close, boy," he urged, his voice devoured by the wind. The dog seemed to understand, shadowing him, his thick coat a meager shield against the biting cold. Their trek began, each step a victory against the deep, drifting snow. Eli locked his focus on the vague, charcoal smudge of trees marking the edge of his land, trusting instinct and memory to guide him through the featureless expanse. The wind clawed at their clothes, a hungry beast stealing their breath. The temperature plummeted and ice needles pricked Eli's skin. They had to keep moving, stopping was a death sentence. He spared a glance for Ruth, her face a mask of pain and exhaustion. He saw the tremor in her limbs with each step and recognized the grit that fueled her onward. Not far now, he roared above the gale, his own throat raw. Almost there. He wasn't sure she heard, but he clung to the words as a lifeline. Buck remained a steadfast presence, offering Ruth's leg a comforting nudge. The dog, sensing the gravity of their plight, had shed his usual exuberance for a focused dedication. The world dissolved into a grayscale study, a desolate canvas of swirling snow and leaden sky. Only the wind's unyielding howl shattered the silence, a mournful symphony of destruction. An eternity later, a faint ember glowed in the distance, a flicker of salvation. His ranch. A jolt of renewed strength surged through him. He quickened his stride, gently urging Ruth forward. "We're here," he shouted, relief cracking his voice. "We made it." The shape of the house solidified from the swirling snow, a compact, resilient structure designed to withstand the prairie's worst moods. Wisps of smoke danced from the chimney, a beacon of warmth in the frozen wasteland. He fumbled with the latch, his numb fingers clumsy. He shoved the door open, ushering Ruth inside, Buck right behind. The sudden heat hit them like a tangible wave. Ruth gasped, her body seizing. She slumped onto the closest chair, her legs unable to hold her any longer. Eli stood for a moment, his lungs burning. He looked at Ruth, the twins, Buck, and a wave of profound gratitude washed over him. They were safe. For now. The ordeal had been brutal, yet it had forged a bond between them, a connection rooted in shared peril and enduring resilience. Together, they had weathered the heart of the storm and emerged, scarred but unbroken, into the haven of his home. Though uncertain trials lay ahead, they would face them united, their lives intertwined by the harrowing events of this day. Sanctuary found. The wind howled a mournful dirge as Eli wrestled open the ranch house door, pushing Ruth inside ahead of him. The sudden silence, compared to the blizzard's roar, was almost deafening. It was a simple space, a single large room serving as kitchen, dining, and living area, with two doors leading off to what Ruth assumed were bedrooms. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something vaguely sweet, pressed against her chilled skin like a warm blanket. "Set yourself by the fire," Eli directed, his voice rough but gentle as he guided her to a worn armchair positioned before a crackling hearth. "I'll tend to the little ones." Ruth sank into the chair, her weary muscles sighing in relief. The warmth seeped into her bones, chasing away the lingering cold of the storm. She watched as Eli, with surprisingly deft hands, unwrapped the twins from their bundled blankets. He laid them gently on a thick quilt he'd spread on the floor near the fire, his movements economical and practiced. "They're sleeping sound," he murmured, glancing up at her. "Good sign." Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The sheer contrast between this sanctuary and the squalor of her abandoned cabin was overwhelming. Here, the floorboards were solid beneath her feet, not rotting and drafty. The fire blazed merrily, a stark contrast to the struggling, smoke-filled hearth she'd fought to maintain. There was even a faint, lingering fragrance of lavender, a ghost of a life lived and loved. Eli moved with a quiet efficiency, adding logs to the fire, hanging their wet clothes on pegs near the hearth, and filling a kettle with water from a pump in the corner. He didn't speak much, but his presence was a comforting reassurance. Faith stirred first, her tiny face puckering in a silent cry. Ruth instinctively reached for her, scooping her up and holding her close. Hope followed suit a moment later, her cries a softer, more questioning sound. "Hungry, I reckon," Eli said, his gaze softening as he watched Ruth settle the twins against her. "I'll fix something." He moved to the stove, a heavy cast-iron beast that looked like it had been there for generations. Ruth watched him, fascinated, as he expertly stoked the fire and began rummaging through a cupboard. He pulled out a bag of dried beans, some salt pork, and a handful of onions. "Bean soup all right?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Anything is all right," Ruth replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Anything at all." As Eli busied himself with the preparations, Ruth fed the twins, savoring the feel of their small bodies against her. The warmth of the fire, the comforting rhythm of their suckling, and the knowledge that they were safe for now filled her with a profound sense of gratitude. She studied Eli's movements, the way he chopped the onions with a practiced hand, the careful measure of salt he added to the pot. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The aroma of the simmering soup filled the room, a savory, earthy scent that awakened a hunger Ruth hadn't realized she possessed. Eli set the table with 2 mismatched plates and spoons, then ladled out generous portions of the soup. "Careful, it's hot," he warned, placing a bowl in front of her. Ruth took a tentative sip and the warmth spread through her, chasing away the last vestiges of the cold. It was simple fare, but it was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful while Eli sat opposite her, watching her with a quiet intensity. "Thank you," she said finally, setting down her spoon. "For everything." Eli shrugged, his gaze dropping to his own bowl. "Just doing what anyone would do." Ruth knew that wasn't true. Many would have turned away, afraid of the burden. But Eli hadn't. He'd risked his own life to save her and her babies, and she couldn't imagine owing someone a bigger debt. Where's your wife?" she asked hesitantly, the lavender scent finally clicking into place. Eli's face clouded over, the light in his eyes dimming. He pushed his bowl away, his appetite seemingly gone. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Passed on last spring." Ruth instantly regretted her question. She could see the pain etched in his face, the raw grief that still lingered. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. He didn't reply, but got up and walked over to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in his heart. Ruth finished her soup in silence, the warmth and comfort of the room suddenly tinged with sadness. She looked at the twins, sleeping peacefully in their makeshift crib, and knew that she had to be strong, not just for them, but for herself. Eli had given them shelter, but their future was still uncertain. They were still strangers, bound together by circumstance and tragedy. And the storm outside, though temporarily held at bay, was a constant reminder of the harsh realities of the world they inhabited. Nursed back to health. The fever possessed Ruth, a clammy grip reminiscent of the cabin's pre-Eli chill. Consciousness flickered, her daughters' faces swam together, an indistinct blur. Eli became her anchor, a quiet presence whose calloused hands, surprisingly tender, coaxed coolness from a dampened cloth against her heated brow. An aroma of sage, tinged with a medicinal undertone, cut through the cabin's pervading dust and icy air. He had seen to her injuries, a pair of gashes, arm and leg, suppurating from neglect and the season's brutal bite. His ministrations were efficient, his expression veiled, yet his touch conveyed careful concern. Now he coaxed broth past her lips, a thin, chicken-infused liquid brightened with herbs. "Just a bit more," he'd rumble, his low voice resonating within her. Too feeble to protest, too grateful to refuse, she swallowed. Miraculously, the twins thrived under his care. Eli, unexpectedly capable, assisted with the girls, deftly changing their makeshift nappies, his large hands cradling their fragility. He crafted the diapers from well-worn flannel shirts, torn and folded with unforeseen precision. "Martha," she showed me, he'd once confessed, his tone brittle upon Ruth's admiring comment. The statement lingered, a silent memorial to his departed wife. He fed them diluted milk from a chipped teacup, carefully angling it to their eager mouths. Hope, the calmer twin, suckled contentedly, her dark eyes riveted on Eli's face. Faith, living up to her name, proved more demanding, her cries sharp and insistent until satiated. Days dissolved into a monotonous rhythm of nurture, sustenance, and rest. Outside, the blizzard roared like a caged beast, battering the cabin. But within, a tentative serenity began to bloom. Ruth's health improved incrementally. The fever receded, leaving her weakened but clear-headed. Her appetite returned, strength slowly building, and the wounds began to heal, forming protective scabs. One evening, as Eli sat by the fire, repairing a harness, courage prompted Ruth to speak. "Thank you, Eli," she managed, her voice still hoarse, "for everything you've done." He didn't pause his work. "They wouldn't have survived another night exposed out there." "No," she whispered in agreement. A silence filled the room, punctuated only by the crackling hearth and the twins' soft murmurings from their makeshift cradle. "Why were you out there?" he inquired, his voice measured, free of judgment. Ruth hesitated, the humiliation still raw, the image of the receding wagon train a recent scar. "We were westward bound," she started, her voice barely audible. "My husband, he succumbed to cholera weeks ago. The others, they claimed I was hindering their progress. They abandoned us." Eli's hands froze. He finally met her gaze, his eyes, the hue of aged steel, scrutinizing her face. There was no pity to be found, merely a quiet understanding. "Out here, people prioritize their own survival," he stated, his tone even. "It's not a game." Ruth nodded, tears welling up. "I understand. What were you hoping to find out west?" he pressed, his gaze unwavering. "A clean slate," she responded, her voice thick with emotion. "A haven where my daughters could flourish, free from their father's death lingering over them." Eli remained silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the hearth's dancing flames. Sometimes, he finally said, his voice laced with a profound sadness that resonated within Ruth, the past, it shadows you, regardless of where you flee. She recognized the truth in his words. Her husband's death, the wagon train's callous act, these would forever be a part of her. But gazing at her daughters, their delicate features illuminated by the firelight, she knew she had to press onward. "What about you, Eli?" she inquired, the question hanging palpable in the air. "Why do you reside alone out here?" He recoiled as if struck. He averted his gaze, focusing on the harness in his hands. "Martha passed," he said, his voice a near whisper. "Winter before last. Pneumonia." Ruth reached out, tentatively, and touched his forearm. His muscles were rigid beneath her touch. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. He offered no response. Yet she sensed a subtle shift, a reduction of the tension within him. "Life out here is demanding," he said at last, his voice regaining its characteristic gruffness. "Especially alone." Ruth surveyed the cabin, the time-worn furnishings, the faded photographs gracing the wall, the lingering essence of Martha's presence. She recognized the loneliness etched onto Eli's face, the emptiness reflected in his eyes. "It doesn't have to be," she offered softly. He looked at her then, his gaze probing, questioning. The firelight flickered in his eyes, revealing a flicker of something elusive. Hope? Apprehension? A yearning for connection? The blizzard continued its assault outside, but within the cabin walls a different tempest was brewing, a storm of unarticulated emotions, shared sorrow, and the fragile promise of a future neither had foreseen. Trapped together. The wind was a ravenous beast, clawing at the cabin's timbers. Frantic snow plastered the windows, dimming the meager light to a bruised twilight. Eli fed the fire, watching the flames leap and devour the kindling, their dance painting Ruth's face in shifting light as she nursed faith. Hope slept on, a small hand fisted trustingly by her cheek. "A devil of a storm," Eli rasped, his words swallowed by the wind's keen. He had the shuttering window. "Could be holed up for days?" Ruth cradled Faith closer, careful not to stir Hope. "Days? Will we make it through?" Apprehension flickered across her face, swiftly veiled by a newfound grit Eli had started to discern. "We'll get through," he declared, conviction ringing in his tone. "Wood stacked, stores are good. We batten down and ride it out." He began reinforcing the window frames, stuffing rags into any hint of daylight. "Prairie life throws these tantrums, Ruth. Gotta learn to heed 'em." The tempest roared without cease through the black hours. Sleep offered only fractured respite, punctuated by the wind's ululations and the cabin's periodic groans. Ruth found a strange solace in the steady rhythm of Eli's breathing from across the room. Dawn revealed a world entombed. After a protracted effort, Eli wrestled the door open, revealing a blinding expanse. The barn was a featureless drift, fence posts vanished. "Nowhere to go," he announced, carving out a narrow passage. "Not even the barn." We tighten our belts. Back inside, the cabin shrank, pressing in. Ruth observed Eli, his motions precise, economical. He inventoried their water, the dwindling woodpile, the modest provisions of beans and cured pork. How do folks endure this existence? The question escaped her lips, a murmur for her own ears. Eli paused, leaning on his shovel. "They learn. Adapt. Know the land's moods, its threats." His gaze softened as he looked at her. "I can school you if you're willing." And so, in the ensuing days of enforced confinement, Eli became Ruth's mentor. He demonstrated fuel conservation, the art of melting snow, how to read the wind's direction even through shuttered windows. He elucidated the telltale signs of exposure, the importance of movement, the peril of frozen flesh. Ruth, for her part, observed Eli with burgeoning interest. She marked the sun-etched lines around his eyes, the weathering of years. She noticed the map of calluses on his hands, the quiet grace underlying his powerful build. She absorbed his tales of the prairie, of its creatures, of its stark, unforgiving beauty. One night, as the wind keened its mournful song, Eli spoke of Martha. Of their shared life, their aspiration to build a ranch, the swift illness that had claimed her. His voice was hushed, tinged with lingering pain that resonated deep within Ruth. "She was a force," he said, staring into the fire's heart. "Knew how to wrestle a living from this place. She learned me everything." Ruth reached out, her hand covering his. His skin was rough-hewn, but warm. "She'd be proud of you," she whispered. He looked up, their eyes locking for a long, charged moment. A spark ignited, quickly quenched by the weight of their individual sorrows, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As days bled into one another, a rhythm developed. Eli stoked the fire, patched the roof, spun yarns of the prairie. Ruth tended to the twins, nursed them, hummed them to sleep. Hope, more aware now, watched Eli with bright, inquisitive eyes, sometimes reaching out to grasp his bristly beard. Faith, never shy, would voice her displeasure until Eli held her, her tiny fingers clutching his own. One afternoon, Ruth gave a sudden laugh. Eli had been patiently trying to teach Hope to stack blocks, but the little girl gleefully toppled each attempt. The sound, bright and clear, resonated within the close confines, dispelling the shadows. Eli's smile was genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Been a long while since I heard laughter in this cabin," he admitted. Ruth smiled him. She remembered her own carefree laughter, a faded echo from a seemingly distant life. Yet, in that moment, confined within the small dwelling with Eli and her children, a thread of hope emerged, a nascent sense of belonging. The storm relented on the fourth day. The wind subsided to a sigh, the snow ceased its relentless fall, and a pale shard of sun pierced the clouds. Eli pushed the door wide, revealing a transformed vista. The world lay shrouded in pristine white, glittering under the sun. "It's past," he said, a quiet relief coloring his tone. Ruth stood beside him, cradling hope. Faith was sleeping. Together, they gazed at the snow-blanketed world, reborn in white. "And now?" Ruth's voice was barely a breath. Eli turned to her, his gaze a complex tapestry of emotions. "Now," he said, "we dig ourselves free." And as they shoveled the drifts from the cabin, they understood they were excavating more than just snow. They were digging themselves out of isolation, out of grief's entrenchment, out of the chains of the past. They were unearthing a path toward an uncertain future, a future now inextricably entwined. The journey for supplies. The silence after the storm was almost as oppressive as the blizzard itself. The wind, which had howled like a banshee for days, was now a mere whisper, leaving behind a world sculpted in white. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, reflected off the snowdrifts, blindingly bright. Eli stood in the doorway of the cabin, his eyes squinted against the glare. He surveyed the landscape, a vast, undulating sea of white stretching to the horizon. The air was biting, a stark reminder of the dangers that still lingered. Turning back inside, he found Ruth tending to the twins near the fire. Hope was nestled quietly in her arms, while Faith squirmed and fussed, her tiny fists waving in the air. The scene, bathed in the warm glow of the hearth, was a tableau of fragile domesticity, a stark contrast to the harsh reality outside. He cleared his throat. "We're running low on supplies." Ruth looked up, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. "I thought as much. Flour's nearly gone, and the coffee's just about done. The babies need milk, and we'll need more firewood soon." Eli ticked off the dwindling resources on his calloused fingers. He walked over to the rough-hewn table and began sketching a crude map on a scrap of paper. "I need to ride to town." A shadow crossed Ruth's face. "Is that safe? So soon after the storm?" "It's not ideal," Eli admitted, his voice gruff. "But we don't have a choice. We won't last more than a few days at this rate. The trails should be passable, though slow going. I'll take the rifle. Shouldn't be more than a day's ride each way if the snow hasn't drifted too badly on the pass." Ruth's gaze flickered between Eli and the twins. The thought of being alone, out here, with only the babies for company was clearly weighing on her. "I can handle things here," she said, her voice firmer than he expected. "I'll keep the fire going and the babies fed. Just be careful, Eli." He met her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken fears that hung in the air. "I will." He paused, then added, "Keep the rifle close. Load it if you have to. And keep the door barred at night." He spent the next hour preparing for the journey. He checked the tack on his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Maggie, ensuring it was secure and wouldn't chafe in the cold. He packed a bedroll, some jerky, and a canteen of water, knowing the journey would be arduous and unforgiving. Before leaving, he approached Ruth, who was now sitting by the window watching the snow-covered landscape. Hope slept soundly in her arms while Faith gurgled contentedly, her eyes fixed on her mother's face. "I've left extra firewood stacked by the door," he said, his voice low. "And there's water in the well. Just be careful when you go out to fetch it. It's likely to be slick with ice." Ruth nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "We'll be fine, Eli. Just come back safe." He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt leaving her alone like this. But he knew it was necessary. He had taken on the responsibility of caring for them, and he wouldn't shirk from it, no matter the risk. He reached out and gently touched Faith's tiny hand. It was surprisingly strong, gripping his finger with unexpected force. He felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Take care of your mother," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. He turned and strode out of the cabin, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He mounted Maggie and turned her towards the town, the snow crunching beneath her hooves. He glanced back at the cabin, seeing Ruth standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light. She raised a hand in farewell, and he returned the gesture. As he rode away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving a part of himself behind. He knew that their survival depended on him, but he also knew that he was becoming increasingly attached to this woman and her children, who had unexpectedly entered his life. The journey to town was not just about replenishing supplies. It was also a journey into the unknown, a step towards a future he could never have imagined. The prairie wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of snow and the weight of his unspoken hopes and fears. Wolves at the door. The wind, a mournful tenor since Eli's departure, now seemed to sharpen into a high, keening soprano. Ruth, huddled by the fire nursing Faith, felt a prickle on the back of her neck. Hope, nestled beside her, didn't fuss, but her wide, dark eyes were fixed on the cabin window. Ruth shifted, adjusting Faith's weight. The light filtering through the frost-etched glass was fading, painting the interior in shades of gray. She glanced at the woodpile, a dwindling mound, and a shiver traced its way down her spine, unrelated to the cold. A low growl, barely audible above the wind, vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. Ruth's breath hitched. Wolves? Eli had mentioned them, a pack that roamed the foothills, bolder in the winter when game was scarce. He'd shown her how to load the rifle, explained about aiming, about keeping her nerve. But Eli wasn't here. She gently shifted Faith to her other breast, careful not to wake her fully. Hope continued to stare, her brow furrowed as if trying to decipher a complex equation. Ruth placed a reassuring hand on her tiny back. Another growl, closer this time, followed by a chorus of snarls. They were circling the cabin. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. She finished feeding Faith, burped her, and laid her gently in the cradle Eli had fashioned from a packing crate. Hope watched every movement, her gaze unwavering. Ruth rose, her legs stiff from sitting. She fetched the rifle from its place above the fireplace. It felt heavy in her hands, cold and unfamiliar. Eli's instructions echoed in her mind, safety first. Aim true. Don't hesitate. She crept to the window, peering through a patch she'd cleared of frost. For pairs of eyes gleamed in the twilight, yellow embers burning with predatory hunger. The wolves were gaunt, their ribs visible beneath their matted fur. One, larger than the others, paced back and forth, its breath misting in the frigid air. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but the sight of Hope's trusting face and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Faith in the cradle hardened her resolve. She was their protector. She would not let them down. Ruth remembered Eli's words about fire. Wolves feared fire. She moved quickly, gathering kindling and adding it to the fire, coaxing the flames higher. The cabin filled with a warm orange glow. She found a small, metal bucket and filled it with sand from the hearth. Then she grabbed a burning branch from the fire, its embers crackling and spitting. Hope whimpered, reaching for her. Ruth knelt and scooped her up, holding her close. It's all right, little one, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Mama's got this. Holding Hope in one arm, the burning branch in the other, Ruth moved to the door. The wolves were closer now, their snarls more insistent. She could smell their musky scent, acrid and wild. Taking a deep breath, she threw open the door. The wolves recoiled, momentarily surprised by the sudden burst of light and heat. Ruth raised the burning branch, waving it back and forth like a fiery sword. Get back, she yelled, her voice raw but firm. Get away from here. The wolves hesitated, their eyes fixed on the flames. The alpha male, larger and bolder than the rest, took a tentative step forward. Ruth swung the branch closer, showering him with sparks. He snarled, baring his teeth, but he didn't advance. Ruth kept waving the branch, shouting at them, her voice growing stronger with each breath. The heat scorched her face, the smoke stung her eyes, but she refused to back down. Finally, the alpha male turned and loped away, the rest of the pack following close behind. They disappeared into the gathering darkness, their howls fading into the wind. Ruth stood there for a long moment, her chest heaving, her arm aching. Then, slowly, she closed the door, securing the latch. She leaned against the door, her legs trembling. Hope nuzzled against her neck, her small body warm and comforting. Ruth sank to the floor, exhaustion washing over her. She looked at Hope, her eyes filled with unshed tears. We did it, she whispered. We scared them away. She rose, latching the window shutters tight, then banked the fire, adding more wood to ensure it would last through the night. The cabin, once again, felt like a sanctuary, a warm and safe haven against the dangers of the wilderness. She checked on Faith, who was still sleeping soundly in her cradle, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. Ruth stroked her soft cheek, a wave of tenderness washing over her. She knew the wolves might return. They were hungry and desperate. But she was ready. She would protect her daughters, no matter the cost. Eli had entrusted them to her care, and she would not fail him. Ruth settled back by the fire, Hope asleep in her arms, the rifle resting beside her. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, a small flame of hope flickered, burning bright against the darkness. Return and relief. The bleak expanse offered only shades of white and gray, the wind a raucous predator clawing at Eli's coat. He pressed his horse onward, urging a pace he'd normally avoid. Guilt was a persistent ache, the knowledge of Ruth and the twins alone and exposed. The hunt had been a desperate measure, driven by need, yet each league separating him from the small homestead felt like an abandonment. Reaching the crest, the cabin finally appeared and his pulse quickened with alarm. Something felt amiss. The familiar plume of smoke was absent, replaced by an unnerving quiet. He spurred his horse to a gallop, the animal responding with a surge, its hoofs drumming against the frozen ground. Drawing closer, the scene became a stark revelation. The snow around the cabin was a chaos of disturbed powder, lacerated by deep gashes. There, etched in the snow, were the unmistakable prints, wolves, circling, converging. A cold fist clenched his gut. He leaped from his horse, rifle raised, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. He reached the door and shoved it open, adrenaline coursing through him. A burnt, astringent odor stung his nostrils. "Ruth," he shouted, his voice strained with concern. The reply was immediate, small voices, a chorus of fear from the room's shadows. He hurried toward the sound, his eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. Ruth was huddled near the cold hearth, the twins clutched tightly in her arms. Soot streaked her face, but her eyes burned with a fierce resolve he hadn't witnessed before. "Eli," she gasped, relief cracking her voice. "You're back." He knelt, his eyes darting over her and the babies, searching for wounds. "What happened? Are you all right?" "The girls?" "We're fine," she reassured, her tone firming. "Wolves, last night." He saw the scattered embers, the hastily piled charred wood. He understood fire, her desperate shield. Rising, he stepped outside. Though kept at bay, the pack had patrolled the perimeter, a brutal reminder of the surrounding wilderness. He noticed the makeshift torches, branches bound in fabric and soaked in oil, now scattered in the snow, their purpose fulfilled. Back inside, he knelt again before her. "You held them off," he said, his voice hushed with admiration. "You kept them safe." Ruth gazed down at the twins, her expression softening with maternal tenderness. "I had to," she murmured. "They're everything." He reached out, his hand hovering, then gently touched little Faith's hand. The baby stirred, her tiny fingers instinctively wrapping around his. A wave of emotion washed over him, relief, admiration, and something profound he couldn't name. "You were gone longer than I expected," Ruth said, breaking the silence. "I grew worried." Eli sighed, raking his fingers through his hair. "The elk were further out than I thought. I pushed hard to get back." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I never should have left you alone." "We coped," she said, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Because of you. I remembered what you taught me about fire." Standing, he fixed his gaze on the remnants of her ordeal, a silent tribute to her courage. He picked up one of the discarded torches, its charred tip still faintly smoking. "I'll build up the fire," he said, turning back to her. "Then I'll set some snares around the perimeter. Won't stop them permanently, but it'll give us a heads up." He worked deliberately, his movements honed by years of experience. He stoked the fire, feeding it wood until the flames danced high, bathing the small cabin in a comforting light. He inventoried their meager supplies, noting the dwindling firewood. Another trip would be necessary soon, but this time he wouldn't leave Ruth and the twins undefended. His tasks complete, he settled beside her, a comfortable quiet enveloping them. The twins were asleep, their miniature chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "Thank you, Eli," Ruth whispered, her voice almost lost in the crackling of the fire. "For coming home." He looked at her, his gaze lingering on her weary face. He recognized the strength in her eyes, the resilience that had allowed her to weather such hardship. "I wasn't about to let anything happen to you, Ruth," he said, his voice soft and heartfelt. He wanted to express more, to tell her of his awe, his gratitude for their safety. But the words remained trapped unspoken. He was a man of action, not pronouncements. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. Her skin was rough, hardened by toil, but her touch was gentle and reassuring. He held her hand firmly, finding solace in her presence. In that shared silence, a new understanding bloomed. They were bound together not only by circumstance but by a shared trial, a mutual vulnerability. Two souls, both bearing the scars of loss, finding comfort and strength in each other's company. And in the hushed warmth of the cabin, surrounded by the howling wilderness, they began to weave a connection strong enough, they hoped, to face whatever challenges the future held. A prairie family. The wolves, repelled by gunfire and the blaze, became a chilling legend carried on the wind's breath. Yet, spring, ever resilient, refused to be subdued. It stole across the plains in shades of jade and ochre, adorning the rugged terrain with wildflowers, mirroring the nascent optimism burgeoning within Ruth. The twins, months older now, flourished. Faith, living up to her appellation, was an exuberant sprite, her joyful cries reverberating throughout the tiny cabin, clamoring for affection and nestling against Ruth whenever possible. Hope, with her quiet demeanor, absorbed the world with unwavering focus, her gaze often drawn to Eli as he repaired fences or cultivated the small patch of earth they called a garden. He, feeling the twins' unwavering regard, discovered tender emotions he thought long lost. He'd unexpectedly find himself humming tunes from his boyhood, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he cradled faith or presented hope with a sunny yellow bloom. Witnessing Ruth, her hair ablaze with sunlight as she nurtured their garden, a warmth he hadn't known existed would blossom within him. As twilight painted the horizon in vibrant hues of persimmon and violet one evening, Eli stood on the porch, captivated by Ruth as she hung laundry. The twins slept soundly within, their gentle breathing a comforting cadence. Restlessness had plagued him all day, a storm brewing within that was entirely unrelated to the elements. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the stillness. Ruth turned, questioning evident in her gaze. "Ruth," he began, his voice raspy. He thrust his hands into his pockets, the worn leather of his gloves sighing softly. "These past months, things have changed." The words seemed inadequate. Ruth waited patiently, her eyes filled with compassion. He inhaled deeply. This wasn't the path I foresaw. The loss of Sarah and the boys. I was adrift, wandering until the land claimed me. He looked out at the prairie, the vast expanse feeling surprisingly less desolate than before. Then you arrived. You and the girls. Turning back to her, his gaze was intense. You're resilient, Ruth. More so than anyone I've encountered. And the little ones, they illuminate this place. They illuminate me. He moved closer, stopping within arm's reach. I know I'm not much. A broken-down rancher haunted by the past with only this land to my name. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But I can offer you a haven, Ruth. Security, partnership, and every ounce of devotion I have remaining. He retrieved a small, meticulously carved wooden band from his pocket. It wasn't precious metal nor store-bought. He had shaped it from mesquite, crafted it with his own hands, imbuing it with all his feelings. Ruth, he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. Will you take my hand in marriage? Become my wife? Allow us to become a family. Silence hung between them, punctuated only by the chirping chorus of crickets and the distant lament of a coyote. Ruth's eyes welled with tears, yet her gaze remained unwavering. He waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, each beat echoing the magnitude of his question. It was a risk, this raw vulnerability. But he knew with startling clarity that he could no longer imagine life without her and the girls. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft yet resolute. Eli, she said, approaching and taking his hand. Her fingers laced with his, a silent pledge. Yes, I will. Relief washed over him, so potent it nearly buckled his knees. He hadn't realized the tension he'd been holding. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger, a seamless fit. He drew her close, enveloping her in his arms. She nestled against him, her body trembling subtly. He held her fast, offering both comfort and solace. Thank you, Eli, she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Thank you for giving us sanctuary. He tilted her chin upward, meeting her gaze. You gave me sanctuary, Ruth, he said, his voice low and tender. You and the girls. You gave me a reason to live again. He kissed her then, a lingering, gentle kiss that spoke of shared grief and newfound hope. It was a promise, a testament to the unexpected love that had taken root in the unforgiving landscape of the prairie. Later, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars ignite in the deepening twilight, Ruth held his hand, the wooden ring a warm weight on her finger. A prairie family, she murmured, a smile gracing her lips. He squeezed her hand, his heart brimming with a love he never thought possible. He looked at Ruth, the woman who had weathered the storm and emerged stronger than ever. He looked at the cabin, modest yet filled with warmth and joy. He looked at the vast, boundless prairie, once a symbol of his isolation, now a boundless canvas of potential. Challenges lay ahead. Life on the prairie was never without hardship. But with Ruth and the twins at his side, he was prepared to confront whatever fate delivered. They were a family, forged in adversity, united by affection, and grounded in the very soul of the prairie. And that was everything.